let's have a look at replacing the crank bearings and seals on this 1980 CR125 motor. As well as the bearings and seals, we're going to need some Loctite, bearing grade Loctite. So a couple of the bearings on this motor have been a bit loose. Just a bit of bearing Loctite will do. The first process is going to involve a press, which is a piece of machinery that doing bearing changes on engines that I wouldn't be able to do without. So first we press the old bearing out, and then as you can see, we've now got that empty cavity for the new bearing to go into. We're then going to press the seal out, and then I'm then just going to put a bit of the bearing Loctite on the outer of the bearing, not too much, and then I'm going to press the bearing in. It's quite easy to damage the bearing if you don't use something to protect it, so I like to use a piece of plastic bar. Oil on bar is what I use, which I've chopped with the lathe, so it's nice and perfectly flat on both sides, and it's not a damaging surface that can damage the bearing, so I use that on the end of the mandrel of the press to press the bearing into place. So I'm going to follow the same process on the other side of the crankcase. So both sides of the crankcase have had the new bearings pressed in and the seals pressed in. Again, I use the same piece of oil on bar to press that, so I can't damage the seal either. Now then, with this bike, one of the crank bearings remained on the crank when I split the case, and as you can see from the picture, that bearing is located very close to the crank web, and it's very difficult to get anything into there. So we use a bearing separator to remove the bearing from the crank. So I clamp the crank into my vise. My vise has got soft aluminium jaws in it, so it's not going to damage the crank, and I'm not going to be twisting the crank in any way, so there's no chance of scoring it or marking it or scratching it at all. So there's kind of two halves to the bearing separator. As you can see, they're like jaws, and they're kind of clamping around the bearing with the sharp edge down to the bottom. Once you've got that locked into place with the bolts on either side, there's then a puller attachment. So there's like two uprights, and then a centre section, and then there's a centre bolt which screws down. Now again, I don't like the idea of that centre bolt touching the end of the crank, so I use another piece of oil on bar, which the big bolt on the puller is going to go down into. I've drilled out a recess into the centre of the bar, and I use this piece of bar for all kinds of stuff, not just this. So yeah, the bolt for the puller is going to go down into the oil on bar, and then the bar is also going to sit on top of the crank, so as I'm putting pressure on, it's not putting pressure with the hard end of the bolt directly against the crank. So once everything's been tightened up, we then start tightening that centre bolt on the puller, and that pushes the piece of oil on bar against the end of the crank, and then as you can see, it starts pulling the bearing away, starts pulling it up and off the crank, and then that's kind of it really. We then gonna press the crank into one side of the crankcase. I'm not just doing that just right this minute, but there you go. That's the removal of the bearings out of the crankcases, removal of the seals with the press, installing the new bearings and seals, and also removing that stubborn bearing off the crank with the bearing separator.